Si no me has visto antes, me llamo Andrea y en este canal hablo sobre buscar trabajo, mercado laboral y liberalismo. Todos los que estamos interesados en este tema sabemos que Irlanda tiene reputación de tener una economía bastante libre. De hecho, ocupa el tercer puesto en el índice de libertad económica creado por la Heritage Foundation. ¿Pero qué piensan los liberales irlandeses de todo esto? Bueno, no puedo saber lo que piensan todos, pero he hablado con uno de ellos. Se llama Keith Redmond y es un expolítico que ocupó un cargo local hasta el año 2019. Antes de que veáis el vídeo hay una cosa que tengo que aclarar de lo que ha dicho. Hay un momento en el que menciona que el salario medio irlandés es de unos 36.000 euros brutos al año. Si alguna vez habéis buscado esto en Google, habréis visto que es de 49.000. Le pregunté por esta diferencia y él me dijo que los 49.000 es el salario medio entre las personas que trabajan a jornada completa, mientras que los 36.000 que él mencionó es el salario mediano, no medio, incluyendo las personas trabajando a tiempo parcial. Habiendo explicado esto, os dejo con la charla. I have Keith Redmond with me today. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation, Keith. As an introduction, Keith is a dentist, which you can see by his background. He was councillor from 2014 to 2019, and he was part of Fine Gael, one of the political parties in government until 2015. How are you, Keith? Thanks.
Very good. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. So before anything else, can you explain what a councillor does for anyone not familiar with Irish politics?
So a councillor is like a local, an elected local government official. So kind of like your member of parliament, but only for a very small local area. The area that I was responsible for was an area in the north, on the north coast of Dublin called Howth Malahide. So it has approximately, I would say 30 to 35,000 people in it. So we're responsible for interactions with constituents and the local authority, the local council. And generally they're to do with kind of run-of-the-mill issues like planning issues or having things fixed by the council, but also in creating bylaws, which are local laws that are enforceable locally, to do with things like parks and dogs and all that kind of stuff, parking. But there's a big component of planning and making sure that people can get planning, or that some councillors are very against, for example, new construction, new building. They're very conservative. They're very kind of ecological. Others are more liberally minded, like myself, who would build anything anywhere. So
we need housing. We need houses.
Oh, apparently there's a housing emergency, but nobody seems to know when they're in the local government.
Yeah.
All they do is listen to the locals who already live there. We call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard, NIMBY. And okay. NIMBYs are people who object to everything, because they already live there. They don't want any competition from newcomers for anything. So they block housing everywhere. So we have these two phrases. I don't know if you're familiar. I know Spanish is your first language. We NIMBYs, so not in my backyard, and YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard. So okay. they're the opposite. So I'm a YIMBY.
Okay, I didn't know that. So Ireland is known for having the third freest economy in the world. Do you feel like we live in the third freest economy in the world?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. The first thing to understand about Ireland is that it's two economies. So there is a foreign direct investment or multinational sector. So that's the Facebook, Google, all the tech companies, all the pharma companies. Ireland has two big international industries, the tech and pharma. And those companies have all been drawn here from primarily the United States, but all across the world, by the low corporate tax rate of 12.5%. And then allegedly the fact that we all speak English and we've got a highly educated workforce, blah, blah, blah. But it's mostly the tax issue. So that sector, the multinational foreign direct investment sector, that economy, if you like, is really productive, really efficient, creates an awful lot of wealth. And the Heritage Foundation, when they examine economies, what they tend to do is look at, for example, low corporate tax rates. Yes, tick, and they look at low hurdles of bureaucracy when establishing a company or running a company. Yes, tick, right? We have that sector, that economy, okay? And it produces enormous amounts of tax revenue for the country. We have, probably, we're a country of 5 million people. Our workforce is maybe 2.7 million. But I would say probably a fifth of our workforce is dependent on the multinational foreign direct investment sector. And almost all of them are over the average industrial wage. So the wage that they produce for workers is much higher. The tax as a result is much higher. And the number of people is like hundreds of thousands of people work in those sectors. So whenever I hear people locally here, like left-wing politicians in Ireland saying, they need to pay higher taxes and we need to charge them higher tax. The only reason they're here is for the taxes, and they'll just leave, and you've created a black hole in your employment, in the employment of the country. You're probably 20-25%. All these people are going to lose their jobs, But they also so that's one sector. Then we've got another economy, and that's the domestic economy. So the domestic economy is definitely, like, for example, we have allegedly a 12.5% tax rate for domestic businesses too, but that doesn't apply to professional services. So, for example, dentistry that I'm in, or accountancy, or law, or medicine, or anything at all, they all have what's called a professional surcharge put on them of 37%. So our tax rate's 50. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So the domestic economy does not get the benefits that the foreign direct investment economy gets. Then we notoriously have the second or third highest tax rates in Europe on income. So when you consider our income tax plus our social insurance plus this weird thing called USC, which is Universal Social Charge, which nobody really understands, but it's basically just tax. When you combine all of those taxes on income together, we have about a 50% income tax on anything over 36,000 euro. So the government gets over half, 52% of your money once you hit 36,000 euro. So you will not be surprised to discover that the average wage in Ireland is 36,000 euro. So what happens is people work up to that point, and then they only work part-time, or they don't work, or they if they have their own businesses, they manipulate it so that they only earn the 36,000 euro, and then maybe their wife earns it, and then their daughter earns it. So like every country in the world, the economy, the productive economy, the domestic economy is formed by the tax system, and people adapt and adjust and amend their lives to the tax system. It's never understood by left-wing economists. They just don't understand. They cannot get their head around the idea that people will adapt to a tax rate. They simply think, well, if 30% tax is bringing us in X, then 40% tax will bring us in X plus 10. Et voila, right? So, and then they're stunned that it doesn't, and they can't understand it. And it's explained to them over and over and over again, but they simply don't want to understand it. So in Ireland, we have this average wage of 36,000 euro. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. They sometimes flip it around and say, oh yeah, but the reason that we have a 50% tax rate up after 36,000 euro is because the average industrial wage is 36,000 euro. No. The reason the average industrial wage is 36,000 euro is because you have a tax rate of 50%.
The other way around, yeah.
Yeah. So they just don't want to accept it, And then we have another tax rate above 100,000 euro only for self-employed people. So they pay 55%, but only self-employed people, because the government officials are not self-employed, so they don't have to pay it, even though they earn over 100,000 euro. So we have a very, very high taxes on income. So when the Heritage Foundation look at the free economies and what makes a free economy, it's generally bureaucracy, corporate tax rates, and ease of doing business. So this is, and then obviously a fully functioning legal system, an independent legal system, which we do have, So there are two economies in Ireland, and that we have this foreign direct investment economy, this multinational sector, which is thriving and flying and, all that stuff. And then we have the domestic economy, which is still restricted by this mentality of very similar to other European countries, high taxes on income. And then we have a lot of impediments to enter different workforces. Like, for example, there's a huge skill shortage in Ireland at the moment. Huge issue with getting qualified people in everything from chefs to, in my business, dentists, dental hygienists, nurses. But every single sector has a problem. The airport at the moment is chaos. People can't get through the airport because we don't have enough security clearance staff. So staff that have actual security clearance to work on the baggage machines. So because we don't have those people, and because, then we have hours and hours of waiting. But again, it comes down to this regulation. There's like a hyper regulatory instinct in Irish politicians that, if it moves, regulate it, and so we have this kind of instinct that just cannot be removed from the system. Over the decades, has been pointed out the harm that hyper regulation causes to Irish, the Irish economy, but also just Irish individuals and individual businesses. Government officials cannot get their head around it. Their reason to be, their raison d'etre is to regulate. So they don't understand that you just don't want them to regulate something. And so we have these ridiculous things where people can't come in from other countries and register as dentists or hygienists in Ireland, even though we desperately need them. The UK is the latest example because of Brexit. The Dental Council in Ireland now has decided that we can't register dentists who qualified in the UK. And they could be Irish dentists who went over to qualify because they have so many more universities over there. They can't come back. It's
everything changed with Brexit.
It's bullshit. It's bullshit.
They are different people now. Okay.
They're different people. The dentists are not real dentists. The education is totally different. Instead of saying they're the same people, it's the same university, it's the same syllabus. They're dentists. This crazy, Mandarin sitting in a room just going, oh, well, they're a third country now. And then we have to, nothing practical, nothing sensible, always hyper regulate. So to answer your question about the Heritage Foundation, they're talking effectively about that other economy, that foreign direct investment, multinational sector economy. You live here in Ireland, so I'm sure you know that when you deal with the domestic economy, you can't get a cup of coffee here without somebody putting a stamp on it, so it's...
Yeah. So people watching me know that I'm very optimistic about Ireland because I'm constantly comparing with Spain, but you are kind of bringing me down to earth. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, Keith, so some people I've known here told me about the 1980s, right, as a very, very tough time for the country. So what memories do you have of those years? What was the country like?
Well, it actually comes back to the original question. So imagine that you got that other economy. Imagine you got that foreign direct investment, multinational sector economy, okay? And removed it, right?
Okay.
That's what the 1980s was like. All we had was this hyper-regulated, hyper-taxed domestic economy, up to 70% income taxes. Everything regulated to the point where you needed a license to do this and a license to do that and a license to do, So all of the negative instincts that are naturally in Irish Mandarins was at the fore. The left-wing economists were all the rage. All you had to do was give your money to the government and they would fix your world. And so we had 70% income taxes. We had crazy stuff. So we had enormous tax evasion because people just were, they didn't want to give their money to the government.
70%.
Oh yeah, 70. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And not at high rates of pay, at relatively medium rates of pay. Once you hit a certain point, 70% income tax. So it was really crazy. But the country was basically in black and white. It was so deprived. It was when I think about it now. I mean, I was growing up there. I was as a kid. So I was born in 1973. So from 1980, I was 7. So from 7 to 17 were the 1980s for me. And it was just, nobody was particularly, the music was dour, the fashion was dour, everything was kind of low. There was no excitement, no optimism, no hope. And it was, we were effectively like an Eastern European country. We were East Germany, basically.
Post-Soviet.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because all our dominant political party at the time, Fianna Fáil, was a center-left economic party with a center-right social conservatism. It's a very unusual mix in Europe. You don't tend to get this kind of like a center-right social conservatism with a center-left economics. But in fairness, both of our main parties from the foundation of the state, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, both shared that. So you couldn't, even if you change your government, you couldn't change the flavour of it. It was always that. We never had a distinct left and right like most countries. In Europe, there was never a kind of a Labour versus Conservative thing. Spain has it, France has it, the UK have it. We never had that. We had this historic thing from the revolution where we had one party Sinn Féin, who split as a result of a treaty where one side supported the treaty with the UK, the other side didn't. And that one party split into two parties, effectively Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and had a civil war. So we had a civil war based on that. But then those two parties after the civil war just stayed, and they shared virtually in all of their ideology. They shared everything, except it was a cultural thing where you were either for the treaty or against the treaty. And that kept going for generations, so you have these bizarre people saying, oh no, I only vote Fianna Fáil or I only vote Fine Gael. They're the same. Like, they're literally the same. They're the same policies, so we don't really have that. Now we're beginning to maybe see the beginnings of that with now things have changed. Sinn Féin, as you probably know, they went on to become much more popular in Northern Ireland because Northern Ireland obviously stayed in the UK. So they were tied to the IRA and the continuation of the campaign, if you like, up there. They've now rebuilt themselves in the south, and they're actually the most popular party at the moment. They're running at 36% in the polls, where Fine Gael are on 20, Fianna Fáil are on 15. So combined, those two kind of old parties are not even as much now as Sinn Féin, which is a very left-wing party. So we're now going to get even more left-wing at the next election.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that actually. So I remember when I read their election manifesto, I read they were planning to keep the corporate tax at 12%, which was really surprising for me, right? Being a left party. So do you think Ireland would change dramatically if they took power?
No, because again, every political party knows about the two economies, and they know that if they mess with the multinational sector, the foreign direct investment, they kill the golden goose. This is the part of the economy that creates the wealth, the tax wealth, and that's where the taxes come from. Is that economy? So even Sinn Féin, who are a left-wing party, know that if they destroy that,
they wouldn't be stupid enough, right? No,
exactly, because they won't be able to fulfill any of their promises. Yeah. Their entire revenue base will collapse, and we'll be back to being the Ireland of the 1980s. So even they know not to do that. But they will screw around with the domestic economy even more. Like, they're talking about having 60% income tax over €100,000. They're talking about increasing the social insurance on employers. They're talking about, it's the left-wing fantasy economics where we just have to put another 5% on and we'll get 5% more. Never ever learn. They never ever learn that doesn't work. Like the Laffer curve, they've never heard of it. They don't know what it is, and even if they have, they don't believe in it. So it's unfortunately, we're going to have to go through a lot of pain, I'd say, in the next 5 years when Sinn Féin get in. But it gives me hope as somebody who's genuinely centre right that maybe we'll have a political reaction, and we'll see something come along that's genuinely centre right, like we did in the 1980s. Because what brought us out of the 1980s was the formation of a party called the Progressive Democrats that I was a member of. And the Progressive Democrats were a genuinely economically liberal party. So they were about reducing bureaucracy, reducing licensing, reducing income taxes. So there was a lot of a lot of improvements as a result of that. But it was only brought about by the fact that people had been squeezed so much in the 1980s. Yeah. Such high tax rates, such high regulation, that's what brought the political impetus for this.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you as well, I asked you about the 80s. What about the early 2000s, when the Celtic Tiger was in? So I heard there were some crazy things happening back there. Do you remember anything, like any anecdote or something showing how crazy the economy was back then?
It was the greatest time ever.
Really?
It was so good. Everybody had money. As it turned out, it was all borrowed money, but everybody had it. Yeah. It was crazy. I mean, what had happened was Ireland was so poor in the 80s and then going into the early 90s that the EU was trying to finance road building and bridges and stuff. So we had this enormous capital program that was funded by EU banks, effectively. And then that led to a property boom, which feeds into a very peculiar, and I don't even know if other countries have this, a very peculiar psychology in the Irish mind, and that is land. So our history is based on basically being subjugated by British, and the British never allowed us to own land, never allowed us to own housing, never allowed all. So in the Irish mind, if you own a plot of land or you own a farm or you own a house, That's your security, and it can never be removed from you. And it's culturally ingrained that, you know, you must own a house, you must own a house, you must own a house. And so that, combined with effectively free money coming from the EU, created this enormous housing bubble, like a massive housing bubble, where Irish people were like, you know, well, one house is not enough. We need to have 4 houses. You know, I mean, if I brought you into a room with alcoholics and I said, well, look, guys, you know, you can have 1 beer or you can have 4 beers. What do you want? They want 4,
course,
right?
Yeah.
So Irish people with housing, it's exactly the same thing. You know, we're addicted to housing. We're addicted to land. And so the notion that you could, you know, buy a house, it would go up in value. And as a result of it simply going up in value, you could use the equity to buy another house. Oh my God, this was delirium for Irish people, you know? So we had this effectively like a kind of a Ponzi scheme that had been set up with houses being bought and sold, get in early, sell it, next year buy another one, blah, 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 and around and around and around. And so there were people making enormous amounts of money from capital appreciation on houses alone. Like you could literally buy a house for say 300,000 euro. And a year later, it would be worth 500,000 euro. So people would sell the house, pocket 200,000 euro, and have 200 grand in their bank. Now imagine doing that over and over and over and over with multiple houses. So, you know, you could be a taxi driver worth, like, you know, on paper worth £1 million in houses. You know, it was, yeah, it was crazy. I mean, I sat in a taxi one day, and this guy told me that it was around the Christmas period, which is a very busy time, obviously, for taxi drivers. And he said, "Oh, this is my last Christmas. You know, as a taxi driver, I'm quitting. I'm retiring in January." I was like, you only seem to be like in your 40s or whatever. He said, "Oh, I'm 48. I was like, "Okay, well, how are you retiring?" Well, myself and 2 other taxi drivers, we bought a block of apartments in Bulgaria. I was like,
Jesus.
A block. And he's like, yeah, a block of apartments. There's 60 apartments in the block. I was like, okay, how? Well, we got a loan from an Irish bank based on the value of our houses here. And we bought the block of apartments in Bulgaria. And it's like, holy shit. You know, and it was kind of then, it was like that apocryphal story of, it was one of the American tycoons who was having his shoes shined on Wall Street one day. And the guy who was shining his shoes said, "Oh yeah, I just want to ask your opinion. What do you think about this share and that share and that?" And he realized that when the guy shining your shoes is in the stock market, it's time to get out of the stock market.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And it was exactly that. This taxi driver had become a property tycoon with 2 other taxi drivers. It was time to get out of property. You know, the whole thing was a bubble. And so when the credit crunch came and effectively just kind of removed the foundations from under this, because it was all based on credit, the collapse was enormous. It was a 60% collapse in value of everything. People were economically destroyed, bankruptcies all over the place. And so it's, it was, to answer your question, the early 2000s was amazing. It was, people, new cars every year, holidays wherever you wanted.
Yeah, but then the hangover.
Then the hangover. We had the party and then the hangover. Yeah. The hangover was awful, you know? Yeah.
So is People Before Profit the leftiest political party we have here?
Yeah, well, People Before Profit is the Socialist Party. So what happened is the Socialist Party, as all socialists do, what's the first item on the agenda? The split. So basically what happens is that the Socialist Party, they split, and it became the Socialist Workers' Party and the Socialist Party. And then they decided that socialism, ironically, they decided in a very capitalistic way, they had to rebrand because socialism wasn't very popular. So one became Solidarity, People Before Profit. The other one became, what was it? I can't remember, something else. But then they've since changed their names many times. But basically, the People Before Profit Party is just the Socialist Party. They just rebranded.
Okay, and are they? I don't know.
Oh, they're communists. They're communists. Yeah.
I was going to ask you: are they like Venezuela and Maduro, like that vibe?
They're big. They're big fans of Maduro. Big fans of Castro. Big fans of anybody at all. I mean, one of the guys who was in the Socialist Party was a guy called Gartland, and he was dealing with the North Korean regime at one stage. In support of them. So it's they're full on communists. They just they repackage themselves as a kind of a populist kind of vibe, but really it's full on communism. You should have no private property, nothing.
Okay. Well, thank God they are a very, very small party here.
Yeah, ironically, they won't even go into government with Sinn Féin next time because Sinn Féin are not left-wing enough for them.
Okay, I'm glad. I'm happy to hear that. And some people think Ireland is a tax haven. So I know it's not, of course, considered as such, but what could you say to that statement? Many people told me that in Twitter. Yeah, okay, Ireland, we know it's a tax haven. So what would you say to that?
Well, first of all, tax havens only exist because tax hells exist. All right. So if you have a tax hell, don't be surprised because you're running a tax hell if somebody else runs a tax haven. Tax, like labor, like capital, like anything, is something that will always seek a more competitive regime. So if you are living in Spain and you can't get a job, or you can only get a job that pays you a very low wage, and somebody says your skills can be brought to Ireland or the UK or Germany, and you can get a much bigger wage. I mean, is that a labor haven? Are you in a labor haven now? You know?
Well, I am. I think I am.
Yeah, no, exactly, right? So you're in a labor haven because you had a labor hell in Spain, right? So tax havens is not a bad thing. Tax haven is it's a competitive world out there, and we're competing for tax revenues like everybody else. I have no problem with being called a tax haven. I don't think it is on the negative definition of that. But I mean, on a positive definition that I would put on it, I think great. I mean, we're competing because we're a small island on the western coast of Europe that's not connected to the mainland, doesn't have geographic advantage, doesn't have weather advantage, doesn't have linguistic or cultural advantage to adjacent countries. And so we have to do something to compete. Otherwise, what do? We just stay there impoverished so other people can feel good about themselves. No, thank you. So we're using our resources, and our resources is ingenuity. Our resources, tax competitiveness. Fine, I've no problem. But if you're running a country that's a tax hell, don't give out about me being a tax haven.
Of course. And it's funny because, heaven is translated as paradise in Spanish. So people think like companies are here paying zero tax and,
No, it's not. And if you, again, just to clarify on the tax haven thing, as we discussed previously, it is a tax hell if you're paying income tax.
Yeah.
Right. It's only a tax haven if you're paying corporate tax on international profits. And so like you're still paying 12.5%, like an eighth of your profits. And that corporate tax revenue that comes in, it represents about 25% of our total tax take. So even though it's 12.5%, it's a quarter of all of our revenue. So that's the importance of it to us. And that's why we're fighting tooth and nail to, protect it.
Yeah. So actually that Ireland, it seems it signed the treaty to bring it up to 15%. Do you think that will affect, Ireland much, like having to raise it to 15?
Yeah, it's a confusing world out there. We don't really know the impact of that because if everybody can go to 15, as low as 15%. It doesn't mean they will. So for example, America is not going to go to 15. Yeah. France is not going to go to 15. I don't know if Spain is going to go to 15, but so if they're not, then great, fantastic. We got 2.5% more, so it's like it would only matter if countries that, like the US went to 15%, then it would matter. But I don't think it's going to matter too much, because for some reason, like they forced through this international treaty, enormous negotiations, enormous amounts of, political capital has to be spent to do this. And at the end of the day, because they're not going to bring their rate down to 15%, it's kind of moot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And still, many companies have their European headquarters here. So they deal with European customers here, something that would be difficult to do from the US because of the time difference. So I think, as long as the rest of the European countries don't bring it down, I think Ireland should be fine. And
what's Spain's corporate tax rate?
25, I think.
Like, why? It makes no sense at all. I mean, if you look at the Spanish economy, it's completely over-reliant on one industry as well, which is a foreign direct investment industry, tourism.
Tourism,
right?
Yeah.
So you have this kind of, you've got this offering that you offer to foreign people, individuals. They come because they like your offering and they spend their money, and that's where you generate your revenue. We do exactly the same, except we speak to companies. We don't speak to individuals because we don't have your weather. So, but like your big industry is tourism. But why should it be like that? For example, in the north of Spain, it used to be an industrial powerhouse, and yet has dwindled over the years. Why would you not, for example, have a 15% corporate tax rate in the north of Spain?
I know. What happens is kind of the opposite. So we have Madrid with a lower taxes in general, because the government there is a bit more, liberal than the national government, and the rest of the communities, the rest of the provinces are calling them like selfish because they have a lower tax. So, and Madrid distributes money, throughout the entire country, and they are still calling them selfish because they are paying less tax.
But I love when a country or an area that has a high tax rate, condemns a country or an area that has a low tax rate and says they're selfish, right? Well, why don't you be selfish? Like, why don't you have a lower tax rate? And they say, well, because you have such a low tax rate, you bring in more revenue. And you go, okay, now make the leap. Maybe you do that. And they go, no, we want a higher tax rate. Why? Oh, because companies should pay their way. Well, companies are paying us more than they're paying you. So they're more of a way to us than they are to you. So why don't you do it?
Yeah, I know. And you have the ridiculous situation when, you have the Catalans, which claim to be so independent and we don't want to be part of Spain and all that, asking the national government to force Madrid to raise taxes. And it's like, okay, you want, sovereignty just for you, right? And not for the other territories. But the Catalan is very left-wing government. That's, they're even more left-wing than the National Socialists in Spain. They're very left-wing. Yeah, they are. So it's not only Spain, right? Southern European countries in general, it's like we can't catch up with the North in terms of job opportunities and salaries. And so what do you think we have done wrong?
You got easy money from tourism and you become over-reliant on tourism. So you think tourism is the most important thing in the world because it's the most important thing in your economy at the moment. So it's kind of like Ireland was, like, I think 40% of Ireland's domestic economy in the 1970s was agriculture. Okay. So agriculture and farming, and, it was the most important thing. And, you couldn't say anything politically against farmers. You couldn't say anything politically against agriculture because it was the most important thing to us, even though globally, or regionally, it wasn't, it was a pittance. It was nothing compared to finance or compared to pharma or compared to industry, but to us, it was the most important thing. And that's what's happened to Southern Europe. Southern Europe, because of the weather, has become kind of almost economically lazy because you only rely on tourism because it's so good. You get the people come in for 4 months of the year. They give you so much money. You think this is incredible. We have to just make sure we do tourism. But really, you should be looking at branching out into, for example, as I said to you, in the north of Spain, which obviously doesn't have the weather that the south of Spain has. Why can't, Galicia, why can't Basque Country, why can't they become industrial powerhouses again? Why can't you have a special tax rate up there, 15%, and, have industrial colleges that train the people, for example, in pharma, train the people in tech, specifically for those industries. Those companies then would become really attracted to that area because you have lovely food, you have lovely weather compared to us, and then you have the same tax rate. You have the kids would all speak English, they'd all speak tech, they'd all speak pharma. That's what you should be doing. But instead, you're trying to open up more hotels for the what's the walk? What's the
Camino,
the Camino, right? So, I had a conversation with a Spanish guy and he said, oh no, our goal is to make northern Spain as popular as southern Spain for tourists with the Camino. I was like, you're completely missing the point. Stop thinking about tourism. Stop. Just stop. Just think about the 5,000 other industries that are out there. And that's what's happened to Spain. That's what's happened to Italy. That's what's happened to Greece. That's, they're all become reliant on hotels, restaurants, partying, great, have that too. But like us with agriculture, have something else, do something other than that, it's, and also if you wanted to get into the kind of state side of things, with the EU becoming bigger and bigger and Frontex becoming this kind of border force that's going to happen. The Mediterranean, let's face it, is our Mexico border, right? So those countries on the Mediterranean are all the ones who should be building up, military and quasi-judicial infrastructure to finance and utilize that. And the funding from Frontex alone has gone monstrous in the last EU budget. It's absolutely huge. But for some reason, we still have Frontex funding going to like Denmark. Nobody's invading from Norway.
Yeah. Okay. So Keith, those were the questions I had. Thank you very much for your time. I leave you come back to your patients. So for anyone listening, it's Monday, so it's a working day and we have to go back to work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.